Each week we open up our show with our Farm Basics time, and what we try to do during that time is take something that we commonly do as farmers and maybe explain that a little bit to young farmers or especially those who do not farm. Well, today we wanted to discuss corn harvest in the fall, silage versus grain harvest.
And we're in a cornfield right now, or right next to a cornfield that is actually going to get cut for silage. And you know, Brian, it looks like there's going to be an awful lot of grain out there. I might want to harvest it for corn, but here's the thing with corn. You can either chop the whole plant and use it for silage. Now, when I say the whole plant, I mean the whole above ground portion of the plant, or you could just take the kernels off the ears and leave the rest of the plant laying out in the field. That's the difference between harvesting silage and harvesting corn for grain.
Okay, so some of these things we will use the term synonymously, like when we say corn, sometimes we mean grain, or when we say grain, we mean corn. But anyway, all this comes back to is we're looking at what's the end use for this product. So for example, there's a dairy a half a mile away from where we're standing. They want everything off this field. They don't just want the grain, they also want all the leaves, the stalk, everything. So we would call that part the stover. So they want the stover along with that grain, the actual kernels of corn that are being produced out here. They want it all. And that's great. And it's nice for us too in some cases, because now more residue leaves the field, and sometimes we really like having that. But the flip side here is we could run through with our own combines and combine that grain, and right now the price for grain is pretty good. So either way, we're going to come out fairly well financially, hopefully, on our farm, as long as we get some tonnage on the silage, because that's how that's bought, is by the ton, or a lot of bushels on the grain side, because that's how grain is sold, is by the bushel.
So if you are harvesting just the grain off the field and leaving all that residue out there, this is going to change the management of how you're going to handle that field going forward. So for the next crop that you're going to plant, you've got a cover of residue that's going to have to get moved out of the way, either tilled down into the soil or just pushed off to the side, so you've got a nice clean path for the seed to emerge with your next crop. Now, the positive side of that residue is you're leaving some of the nutrients that are in the residue out in the field, and you also have that residue that's going to cover the soil and protect it from erosion. Those are good things. The downside, of course, is now you have to deal with that residue. Now, if you're in a silage situation, hey, you don't have all that residue out there, so how are you going to protect the soil so you don't have erosion? The biggest thing that farmers will do as they cut silage is just do no-till. Leave those little stubs of stalks that are out there, maybe they're a foot tall out in the field, and just leave those. That'll protect from some of the wind erosion, and if you're not doing any tillage, then that's going to protect your soil a little bit more from rain and water erosion.
So Darren mentioned when residue's out there, there are nutrients that are released out of that residue over the course of the next year or so. Well, what farmers do when silage is cut a lot of times is they'll have manure brought back to the field. So for example, this field will most likely get manure on it this fall after the silage is cut, and that's the way to replace nutrients and then some going into our next crop.
Well, that's a great thing about growing a corn crop. If you have dairy or livestock farmers around you, well, you could have the option of using that field for silage, or you could just harvest it for the grain.
Oh, and one other real quick thing, with silage, we can typically harvest that a month and a half earlier than we can the grain corn, so it really spreads our workload out when some of our corn goes for silage and some goes for grain.
I love spreading the workload out because we may need more time to control our weed of the week. Can you identify this week's weed?